My name's Bryan, and this is my friend and guru by Michelle's helping me today with service. I want to start with a reading from Rays of the One Light by Swami Kriya-yoga. This is commentaries on the Bible and the Bhagavad Gita. Week 10, Dogmatism versus Common Sense. Truth is one and eternal. Realize oneness with it in your deathless self within. The following commentary is based on the teachings of Paramahansa Yogananda. In the Gospel of St. Matthew, chapter 7, Jesus warns, "Beware of false prophets, which come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravening wolves. You shall know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes of thorns or figs of thistles? Even so, every good tree bringeth forth good fruit, but a corrupt tree bringeth forth evil fruit. A good tree cannot bring forth evil fruit, neither can a corrupt tree bring forth good fruit. Wherefore by their fruits ye shall know them." Jesus here, as indeed many times during his teaching, counsels people to use their God-given common sense and not to rely on high-flown but undemonstrable claims. Common sense goes beyond abstract reason, for it is rooted in actual experience. Even common sense, however, is deficient when the judgment called for goes beyond sensory experience. Ultimately, what he emphasized always, therefore, was intuitive perception. Thus, he expected more of his disciples than crude common sense, and often scolded them for being too literal-minded, as he did elsewhere when they thought his statement, "I have meat to eat that you know not of," meant that he had steaks or sandwiches secreted about his person. His reference, of course, was to spiritual, not material substance. Words, even though appearing in the scriptures, are no substitute for direct perception of truth. Therefore, the Bhagavad Gita says in the 2nd chapter, "The sage who knows God has as little need for the scriptures as one might have for a pond when the whole land is covered in flood." Thus, through Holy Scripture, God has spoken to mankind. Om, Om, Om. Well, welcome to the shortest Sunday of the year, 23 hours. I was politely reminded by a younger adult yesterday that, not being able to remember to set your clocks ahead was kind of a scourge of those of us who are a little bit older and had clocks like this one that we haven't set ahead yet. Everybody of the modern age is relying on their phones, which automatically move the clocks forward, and therefore your alarm clock is good. So we'll see if we're dating ourselves if people start straggling in around 11 this morning. I can tell you my cat was just thrilled to eat an hour earlier. And dogs too. I mean, this is one of the few points that dogs and cats can see eye to eye on. They're super thrilled. They're super thrilled every March, and then they're super bummed out every November when we change the clocks back. And for a long time, there's been in the legislature, the federal legislature, especially in 2022, they came very close to either getting rid of daylight savings or getting rid of or going on permanent daylight savings. And so I'm sure the cat and dog lobbies have been confounding things, and this is why after many years, actually we tried it in 1974 and it didn't work that well. So there's arguments on both sides, and but the dogs and cats are definitely on the same page about that. So false prophets, remember that Jesus incarnated to the house of Israel, to the Jews, at a time when the teachings had become very corrupt. And in giving this talk about, observe a prophet by their fruits, because everybody can tell a bad fruit from a good fruit, is really just a call for using your common sense to evaluate what the teachings are and what the outcomes of those teachings are. So there were some false prophets at the time of Jesus and in the decades preceding, and particularly because the Jewish tradition, religious tradition, had said for centuries that there was a Messiah coming. And so this sensitivity about a Messiah being a true Messiah or a true prophet was a point where Jesus was saying this. He's not just saying this to his disciples, he's actually saying it to the multitudes, whatever that means, a group of people, people who aren't disciples. Because a lot of people, just like I suspect a lot of us in the room here, have had difficulties with the dogma of a religion and have pulled away from that religion because the dogma was so rigid. And Jesus is coming in, rather than saying, well, here's some counter dogma that you can throw back at, these people that are saying a certain truth as they portray it. He's really saying, use your common sense. So common sense is, it's beyond logic. I was able to read a little story this week online about one of our Go-Rabis who lived in New Mexico, and they used to go to the Carlsbad Caverns often and do tours there. And there was a tour guide there who said, he was describing the caverns, and he said, these caverns are 4,000,004 years old. And somebody said, well, how did you get that number? And he said, well, when I trained as a tour guide 4 years ago, they told me that it was 4 million years old. So logic isn't the same as common sense, right? A little bit of loss of perspective there about millions of years and actual years. And really, Jesus is giving us, in a very modern sense, a scientific way to evaluate people who portray themselves as prophets. Because he's saying, what's your experience of it? And especially, what's your inner experience of it? To his Guru-Rabis, to his disciples, he's saying, as Swami's reading here says, he's saying, you need to use common sense, like I'm telling most people, but you need to also go towards intuitive perception. And, this example in the reading about the disciples being confused by the statement about, I have meat to eat that you know not of. There was another time when the disciples' sort of common sense got in the way of them understanding a deeper meaning about what he was talking about. And that's had to do with around the time that, around this time of year, shortly before Palm Sunday and Easter, Jesus was notified by Mary and Martha that their brother Lazarus was very ill. And Jesus waited a couple of days before he went to see him, but at a certain point he said to his disciple, and the disciples were like, let's not go there, because things were starting to heat up in Jerusalem, and Lazarus lived about 2 miles outside of Jerusalem. And the Pharisees were getting very agitated because their dogma was being met with people's experiential dismay with it. And this was a threat to the Pharisees, the corrupt priesthood of the time. And so Jesus says, I will wake him, meaning referring to Lazarus. And the disciples are like, well, if he's very sick, why would you want to wake him up? We want to let people who are sick sleep. This is their common sense, or the level that they're interacting with. So he goes there, and they find out that Lazarus has been dead for 4 days. And then he says, bring me to where he's buried in the tomb, and and he asks him to remove the tombstone, and everybody's like, well, no, the body's, it's going to smell really bad. It's been in there for 4 days. And again, he's saying, just remove this. And so the lack of the disciples' attunement to what Jesus actually meant when he said, I will wake him, which is he's resurrecting him, is another example of where even these very advanced disciples missed the meaning of something that could intuitively be understood, especially given that they would trust their guru, trust their master. So let me just check here what else I want to say. So intuitive perception, we have to think about what intuition actually is. And Master says that intuition is that capacity of the soul to be able to perceive truth without the intermediary of the senses, without using your senses. And so even common sense is something that's on a different level than intuition. And it's that direct perception. The closest word that I think we have to it is feeling. You have a feeling about something. And we're not talking about emotional feeling about something, but a feeling about something. And that ability to intuit an understanding, well, first of all, it gives you access to so much more knowledge than anything that could come through scripture, anything that could come through Encyclopedia Britannica or Wikipedia or anything else. The philosopher Kant, German philosopher, said, can man know all of the knowledge in the world? And he said, can a cup hold the whole ocean in it? To which Yogananda says, if that cup is the vast receptacle of intuition, then yes, you can hold the world's knowledge, all the knowledge. Yogananda talked about, at a certain point, he never read books after a certain point. He's only did a little bit of scripture with his gurus, Swami Sri Yukteswar. He said that I'm drawing on the vast divine library. He says I can talk 24 hours a day, morning, noon, or night about any subject with anybody because I'm drawing on the intuition, my knowledge through intuition. And of course, many of us are not there, but we can still learn to develop our intuition, to attune. I was thinking of the disciples missing the meaning of what Jesus said once in a while, and so we need to think about what are the fruits of Jesus' teaching. If we accept that he's a true avatar, a true prophet, what are the fruits? Whether it's the teaching themselves, which were not written down at the time, or maybe they were written down close to that time, but he didn't write the truth. He didn't make scripture himself. So there's the teachings themselves, and then there's the miracles. So a lot of the fruits that pulled a lot of people towards Jesus at the time and caused such a disruption for the Pharisees were the miracles. And this public miracle of resurrecting Lazarus was coming at a time where things were really heating up, and large numbers of people were starting to understand that maybe this is the Messiah that has been so longingly awaited for so many centuries. But people can do miracles, prophets can do miracles, and those are good, and those are certainly experienced as evidence or proof to people who are skeptical, but they're limited to that person's lifetime. And what's so much more important, so much more enduring, is the consciousness that master instills in their disciples. So the disciples are one group or one fruit, so to speak, that you can judge a alleged prophet by. What are the vibrations of the consciousness that is extended into the disciples, and that the disciples carry on? So much bigger gift, much more closely approximating that universal truth. And remember, truths are forever. Truths are eternally true. And falsehoods, fortunately, falsehoods from a false prophet are short-lived, relatively short-lived, because things that are false are not permanent. Only truth is permanent. Yogananda used to laugh about this. We've been hearing some pearly gates jokes recently, and Yogananda had one that he got a chuckle out of, about a minister, a Christian minister who was very popular, had a huge church, and for many years was very, very popular. And he died, and he went up to the pearly gates, and St. Peter's there, and St. Peter consults his book and says, "Well, I'm sorry, but you're not on the list here." And this minister got indignant, and he said, "Well, what do you mean? What about all those souls that I sent here?" And so St. Peter consults his book again, and he says, "Well, you may have sent them, but they didn't get here." Again, your disciples are, the consciousness of the disciples, as long as the consciousness, the Christ consciousness in this case, is carried on this planet, then helpers, high souls, will reincarnate to help give new life to that attunement to the Christ consciousness. So this is a permanent, Yogananda says intuition is as big as the universe. It's as big as the universe. We used to think, we sometimes think, or I think, I had a little bit of intuitive insight about this little thing over here, and I had this little thing over here. And really what the challenge is for us is to be able to attune to and feel and develop that feeling. If a teaching is agitating to us rather than calming to us, that's a pretty good sign that maybe it's not a true teaching. That all true teachings are going to help us go inward, to be calm, to be accepting. I sent a prayer out 2 or 3 weeks ago to try to understand the connection between this topic about false prophets and the reading, because Swami puts these together for some reason, and I just couldn't figure out, how does forgiveness fit with, know them by their fruits? So in true form, about a week ago, I got an experience handed to me last Sunday where I was going to my CPR class, cardiopulmonary, which I need to do every 2 years for my license and therefore for my job. And so I had scheduled this like 6 weeks before, and 3 o'clock Sunday afternoon, last Sunday, I went, and there was nobody there. And I got into the building, and there was nobody there. And they said, yeah, sometimes they do CPR classes. They call them basic life support now, but sometimes they do them in this room, and so this room's totally empty. There's nobody there's no cars in the parking lot except mine. And I was like getting more and more upset, and I said, well, I'll give them 20 minutes, and I called the phone number and left a message, and the message machine said, oh, we'll get back to you in 5 or 10 minutes. You know, they gave us a phone number specifically for if you're having trouble, like you're running late to class or something, you know, call this number. There was no class, there was no teacher, and I was pretty upset about it for about 24 hours. It took me to, you know, because I left 2 messages with them on 2 different phone numbers, and then I emailed them. I said, I got an email on Saturday saying, reminder, you have your class at 3 o'clock tomorrow on Sunday. They also sent me an email on Friday, which said, we're sorry, we have to cancel this class. But I missed that email, and I only saw the other ones. Anyways, it was a whole thing in my head, and I just couldn't let it go. And what the internal experience was, well, I couldn't let it go for a day or so. What the internal experience was just agitation and being angry. And I spent an hour and a half, and I drove, you know, all this time, and you guys didn't even tell me about it. Well, it turns out that they sort of tried to tell me, but I don't think I could think of it in terms of forgiveness, partly because of my own misperception, I guess, that, well, yeah, I'm aware of forgiveness, and especially for forgiving individual people, like in close relationships, particularly. I'm all about, you know, understanding that and taking, but I just kept plowing ahead with feeling indignant and wronged, and something needed to happen, and I think that the connection there for me was I wasn't able to experience calmness, that this part about forgiveness is really about the power for those of us forgiving. I mean, it could have a good impact on the person that you're forgiving, that's great, but it really has, I think he calls it the sword of victory. The sword of victory that you're forgiving folks. I recently read an article by Liat Atlil, who's an Israeli-American woman who was taken hostage on October 7th during the Hamas terrorist attacks on southern Israel. And she was taken hostage and was released after, I think, 54 days or 59 days. And she wrote this article saying, and that the title of it is something like, Choosing Rebirth Over Revenge after being released as a hostage. And she talks about this Jewish tradition of the Hebrew words tekuma, which is rebirth, translates as rebirth. And she doesn't talk about, oh, I forgive them. But the principle seems to be the same there, because she's talking about she worked at the Holocaust Museum, and so she took her inspiration from the Holocaust survivor generation, of which my mother was part of, and said, if those people could recreate themselves, recreate their lives, move forward, then so can I. And it's only 2/3 of the way through the article where she says, you know, my home was totally destroyed, my 3 children survived, partly by luck and partly by hiding themselves and protecting themselves. But my heart of hearts, my husband was killed. And she said the devastation was so thorough. They burned down the house, they destroyed the house, they even killed her dog. And for this person to be writing about, and I guess I can read you something that's, she's saying that, I long to mourn with my neighbors, but I haven't had that chance. She's been released since, I think, December. We must commit ourselves to rebirth with the same determined optimism of the Holocaust survivor generation. Without it, we will only sink further into the cycle of mutual anger and victimhood that has plagued our relationship with the Palestinians for too long. I want to focus on building a better future for my 3 children and for the children of Gaza. Now, I don't know whether she was going through some aspect of forgiveness, but this is to my mind, this is the same essential moving forward, clearing out anger, clearing out resentment. And there's an interesting piece. I'll just close with reading this quote from Yogananda, who's saying, because like for myself last Sunday, I was partly sunk in feeling how unfortunate I was that my class had been canceled and my time had been wasted, blah, blah, blah. So in May of 1940, Yogananda writes this passage. And just to give you context, in May of 1940, Germany had invaded Denmark, Norway, Finland, in that month also France, Luxembourg, Belgium. And so things were looking very tumultuous, very troublesome. Yogananda says, just think what is happening in the lives of people in Europe today and realize how much more fortunate you are. No matter what you're going through, poverty, sorrow, ill health, remember that somebody on this earth is suffering 100 times more than you are. Well, that to this point sounds a little bit like you better eat your spinach because people are starving and so. But here's the piece that really impresses me. Do not consider yourself so unfortunate, for thus you defeat yourself and close out the omnipresent light of God that is ever seeking to help you. Do not consider yourself so unfortunate, for thus you defeat yourself and close out the omnipresent light of God that is ever seeking to help you. God's always seeking to help us, always available through our intuition. May we all feel that level of forgiveness and enlightenment and intuition in our lives. Om Shanti Shanti.